we buy things with money, but we really pay for them with our time. And so that says there's really two prices. There's the money price, but there's also a time price. Money prices are expressed in dollars and cents, but time prices are expressed in hours and minutes.
Gail Pooley is former professor of business management at Brigham Young University in Hawaii and the co-author of Superabundance, the story of population growth, innovation, and human flourishing on an infinitely bountiful planet.
The economic underlying numbers of our fundamental basic commodities that really give us these kinds of lives that we enjoy, those are all becoming much more abundant.
Contrary to the belief that the world is overpopulated and humans are a burden on our planet, Pooley argues that there's actually a positive correlation between population and resources.
As he began to look at the price of things that were non-renewable, copper, chromium, iron, he noticed that these prices had all been decreasing, not increasing. So with that data, he developed this theory about how things become more abundant.
This is American Thought Leaders, and I'm Yanya Kellick. Gail Pooley, such a pleasure to have you on American Thought Leaders.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here.
Gail, I've had a really amazing time speaking with you over the last few days, and I've learned a lot about abundance. I've learned a lot about superabundance,
okay.
Of course, right? Because this is your now famous book. This is a completely different way of looking at the world that isn't necessarily intuitive, but the moment that you learn about it, it starts scratching at you. That's what I noticed. It starts scratching you, you start thinking about it, and actually it's a way to change your view of the world, and I think in some ways in a very positive way. So let's dive in here. Okay, and superabundance, where did this whole idea come from?
Well, first of all, I want to recognize my co-author, Dr. Marion Tupy at the Cato Institute. He and I met him over Twitter. We began this discussion that was about in the 1980s, there was this bet between Julian Simon and Paul Ehrlich. If you remember, Paul Ehrlich had written this book in 1968 about the population bomb and said everything was going to blow up. And Julian Simon, this obscure economist, read the book and initially thought, well, you know, the theory seems reasonable, but he said, maybe I should look at the facts, the historical facts of what the relationship has been between population and resources. And as economists, we count things, but the price of things really contains much more information than the quantity of things. So as he began to look at the price of things that were non-renewable, copper, chromium, iron, he noticed that these prices had all been decreasing, not increasing. So with that data, he developed this theory about how things become more abundant. It's because we've been increasing knowledge at a much faster rate. And in economics, we had this, we've discovered lots of really useful things, but we made a couple of fundamental errors. And the first errors, I call them the original sins of economics. The first original sin is that we conflated or we equated resources with atoms. We made the Thanos mistake. And we recognize that there are a fixed number of atoms on the planet, but atoms, in order to become a resource, you've got to add knowledge to atoms. It's knowledge that makes atoms valuable resources. Our wealth is really knowledge. It's not these physical atoms. That's the first mistake that we think was made. There's really no limit to the ability for us to discover valuable new knowledge. And it's knowledge that we should be thinking about. And then the question is, well, where does knowledge come from? Growth, economic growth, is learning. So when people have the opportunity to learn and cooperate with each other and share their new knowledge, that's how this value gets created and shared. And then the second sin was that we measured things in economics with money. Now the rest of science, there are 7 units of measurement in science. 6 of those units rely on time. Instead of using money, we should have used time to measure things. Time has all these features that make it much more valuable as a unit of measurement.
Well, so let me just jump in, because the first part I think is easy to grasp. The second part isn't necessarily obvious.
Well, think about this. We buy things with money, but we really pay for them with our time. And so that says there's really two prices. There's the money price, but there's also a time price. Money prices are expressed in dollars and cents, but time prices are expressed in hours and minutes. And it's pretty simple to calculate a time price. What is the money price, and divide that by your hourly income. So if something costs pizza costs $20, and I'm earning $20 an hour, that pizza, the time price is 1 hour or 60 minutes. So then the question becomes, as you look at the time price of things in your life, how does that compare to the time price of that item 10 years ago? What did your parents pay for that thing? Not the money price, the time price. And that was really what Mary and I began to kind of explore, is the time price of all of these different commodities. We were really asking this question: if Julian Simon was alive today, would he win that bet today? And two criticisms of the bet was it only covered 5 items. Simon let Ehrlich pick the 5 items, and he picked chromium, copper, nickel, tin, and tungsten. And the bet was over a 10-year period. It was from 1980 to 1990. And they put $1,000 on the table, and the loser was going to have to pay the winner the percentage change in the real inflation-adjusted prices. Well, in 1990, Paul Ehrlich writes a check to Julian Simon for $576.07. The real price of these 5 commodities had fallen by an average of 36%. Well, how could that have happened? That decade was the decade that had the largest increase of human beings on the planet. Over 850 million people were added to the planet. So you increase population, but this abundance of resources is increasing at a faster rate. How could that happen?
Well, that's not necessarily obvious. I'm going to get you to jump in here, right? Because yes, the price went down, but that doesn't mean there's more actual resource.
Well, one thing that we think about is, if you try to measure, engineers, biologists, I know you're a biology major, but biologists, engineers, accountants, when you ask them how much you have, they will go out and count the thing and divide it by your consumption rate and say, well, you've got 10 items here and you're consuming 2 a year, so you've got 5 years left. Well, economists don't think quantities are important, but prices are much more important, because it's the price of something that tells you its relative scarcity. It's the price that contains all that information from everybody who's buying and selling. This represents how scarce or how abundant this particular item is. So we look at prices. Prices have much more information, and consequently, they are a much better indicator of what people sense is happening to this flow of resources. It's not the stock that counts, it's the flow. How much can you produce tomorrow? It's not how much you have, it's how much you can create tomorrow, and that shows up in an economy in the form of prices. Okay. So we think in prices instead of quantities. That's the first step. And then the second step is, what price should you use? Should you use the money price? Well, time has a number of advantages over money. The first thing is that when you have an innovation, when you have new knowledge, it shows up both in the price, but it also shows up in people's hourly income. And so a time price is looking at both those numbers and looking at the relationship between those two numbers. When we get CPI numbers, the inflation rate's gone up, that tells you how much more expensive that item's become, but it doesn't tell you about affordability. You've got to ask this other fundamental economic question: compared to what? Well, the price went up 10%, but if your income went up 15%, it's actually the time price is going down. Your life is becoming more abundant because it takes you less time to devote to be able to have this thing. So scarcity is really about what we want. Abundance is about what we have, because scarcity is a function of, what are my wants? They're really infinite. So we live in this scarce world compared to what I would love to have, I'd like to have. But abundance looks at, what do you have today, and how much time did it take you to earn the money to buy that thing, compared to how much time did it take you yesterday. The second advantage is time prices transcend all of this contention and subjectivity with the CPI. You don't have to worry about that. You can go completely around that and not worry about trying to make all of these adjustments. The third advantage of a time price is you can go to any country at any time and look at any good or service, any product or service, and calculate the time price. I can go to Paris in 1850, figure out what the time price was for a loaf of bread. So it lets you make these comparisons across time and across products. You don't have to worry about making currency adjustments. Just say what was the money price and what was hourly income. The next benefit is that time is this universal constant. Of the 7 measurements that we use in science, 6 of them are a function of time. Economics needs to be like the rest of science and use time to measure things. It's constant, but it has a flow, and every one of us on the planet have this sense of what an hour is. And the last benefit is that time, we have this perfect equality of time. We all get 24 hours a day. So if you start, instead of measuring people's inequality of income, measure people's inequality of time. What do you get to do with your 24 hours, and what do I get to do? If you do that, you realize that we are much more equal in terms of what we get to enjoy with our time.
Okay, that's very fascinating, because I'm going to have to get you to give me some examples of that. So you went out in Superabundance in the book. You actually did an incredible amount of research, looking across all sorts of different areas to assess these time prices and how those time prices have changed over time. Were you already expecting to find a certain answer at the beginning, or were you surprised to find an answer along the way?
Yeah, we were shocked, quite frankly, because we initially said, well, Simon made this bet in 1980. Let's go back to 1980. We said, well, one of the criticisms is it was only 5 items, and it was only for 10 years. So we said, well, why don't we do 50 items? So we looked at energy. So we looked at oil and gas and coal. We looked at food. So we looked at coffee and tea and bananas and chicken and beef. And the World Bank actually keeps track of all of these commodity prices. Every month they produce this nice report. So we had all this data from the World Bank. It's like, they got all this data. Let's analyze it. And so we also looked at materials like lumber and cotton. And then we looked at metals again, iron and aluminum and gold and silver. And we expected to find one of these 50 that had become more time expensive. Well, to our surprise, not a single one had become more expensive. In fact, when we did the first study, it covered from 1980 to 2018, so a 38-year period there. The average time price of these 50 basic commodities, we call it the basic 50, had fallen by 72%. That means when I walk into the store, everything's 72% off. I'm almost 3 times richer than I can get almost 3 times more than I did in 1980 of all of these commodities on the average. And this occurred once again at the same time the population had increased about 72%. So we noticed that every time you increase population by 1%, this abundance would increase by 2 or 3 or 4%. Because remember, as the price goes down, that's suggesting that the abundance goes up, and it's actually a geometric exponential relationship. So think about this. Price goes off by 50%. It means I get 2 for 1. Well, what happens if it goes down by 75%? What do you get? You get 4 for 1. 80%, you get 5 for 1. 90%, you get 10 for 1. So you're getting this exponential effect and this abundance factor. So we did these 50 items, and we write this paper about it, and some people said, you should take your framework, your time price framework, the way you analyze things, and you should write a book about this. So we said, well, okay, we'll go look at some other things. So we went back to 1960. We says, well, can we go back to 1960 and see what happened there? The problem is you go back further in time, the data becomes thinner and thinner, but we were able to look at 37 of these commodities back to 1960. Same thing. We've got these market fluctuations that happen, but this underlying trend of increasing abundance is just as solid as could be with all of these things that we looked at. And then we said, well, let's go back to 1920. Let's go back 100 years and see what it looks like. Same thing. We went back to 1850. And we looked at, I think it was 42 basic commodities that professor up in Canada had been tracking, and same thing. And in that case, these commodities, and many of them had dropped by 90 to 95%, which means you get 10 today for the price of one, or 20 today for the price of one. So then we thought, well, we've looked at these commodities. Why don't we look at some consumer goods? So we pulled out a Sears Roebuck catalog from 1919 and start looking through items in Sears Roebuck. And we find a bicycle, for example. It was $12.95. Okay, that's pretty interesting. This seems pretty cheap. Today you can go to Walmart and buy one for around $100. So the money price looks like it had gone up. But when we compared it to people's hourly income, for the time it took a person to earn the money to buy a bicycle in 1920, you can get 22 bicycles today. So it's like we're having all this bicycle abundance. So we go up to 1979. Sears Roebuck, these catalogs are great because they have all of these items. Many of them really haven't changed. A bicycle, microwaves, blenders, toasters, clothing items. And we're seeing all of this, all of these items indicating an increase, a decrease in price, time price, which means we were having this increase in abundance. So we ended up doing this. We looked at 18 different data sets of all kinds of things, and that's what we do in the book.
So it's still difficult for me to kind of conceptualize why you can be so sure that abundance is reflected in the price.
Okay, think about, let's talk about copper for a minute. Why did copper become valuable? Well, it became valuable really because we had this telephone system that required copper wires to be able to transmit the signal. And as more and more people wanted telephones, we need more and more copper wires, so you have this pressure on the price of copper. Well, as that price goes up, it's sending signals to people. This thing is becoming more and more costly. You should either use less of it or try to figure out how to make more of it or recycle it, or you should maybe think about a substitute. Well, what did we substitute for copper? We substituted fiber optic cables that were made out of sand. And suddenly you have this huge new abundance of the ability to communicate, but you're not using copper anymore. What you're doing is you're replacing copper with new knowledge. And today, you're using your iPhone. You're not hooked up to anything. Well, how did you do that? We discovered this new knowledge of how we could transmit signals to each other through the air. We're not using copper or fiber at all. We're using knowledge to be able to create this wealth and this value that we enjoy. And the historical trend is people have additional measures of freedom. If they're not hungry, you tend to have more time. You have more time and you're not hungry, and you can devote your time to this discovery process. You're going to find something, and then when you share it with somebody else, that knowledge doubles. So when I have a Snickers bar and I give it half of it to you, we each have a half, but if I have a piece of knowledge, I give it to you, knowledge is doubled. Jordan Peterson makes this interesting observation. He says, if you can figure out how to do something, make as much in half the time, you're twice as smart. You've doubled your knowledge, and that's this feature that knowledge has that atoms don't have. Knowledge has this ability to grow, and it's not rivalrous. I can share my knowledge with you, and I haven't lost it. I think the subtitle of our book is about resources on an infinitely bountiful planet, and people say, well, how could it be infinite? Because our ability to discover new valuable knowledge really doesn't have any kind of a limit other than our will and our desire and our permission to encourage everyone on the planet to get on learning curves and discover some new knowledge. If we're all doing this for one another, and then creating the products and having markets and have this freedom to innovate, we can continue this path of really superabundance, which we define as our resources are increasing at a faster rate than our population.
So I have a series of thoughts. I'm going to kind of quickly articulate them, and we'll see which ones you want to handle first, okay? The first thing is, I'll give an example, right? Let's say you're living in a community, right, and you're noticing that crime is increasing. This is something that I've observed, okay, in both my community in New York City and community in Washington, D.C. There's some kind of decrease in quality of life there. Over that same time period, right, resources, the time price of resources may have gone down, is what I'm looking at. So how does quality of life figure into your measurements?
Quality of life is a challenge to measure. At the same time, there are some fundamental measurements that we can always look to and say, are we getting better in that at that level? Think about Maslow's hierarchy. We have this basic level of physical needs. Well, what's happened to your price of food? What's happened to shelter? What's happened to clothing? All of those prices have been doing this.
Well, sure, but I could also argue that the quality of the food in many cases, the nutritional value has gone. While the price has gone down, it's partially because the quality of it has gone down, whether it comes to clothing, whether it comes to food, and I think that's measurable and has been measured.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. I think what we did in our initial study, when we looked at just these basic commodities,
right,
we were looking at just what does a bushel of wheat cost today versus a bushel of wheat 40 years ago, and those really haven't changed. Now, what we're using to create our food has clearly changed in that time period. One of the little analyses we did was to look at the amount of time that a person has to spend just to earn the money to buy their daily food. You go back to 1960, in India, it took about 8 hours of work to be able to earn the money to eat that day. They were living on subsistence. If you didn't work, you didn't eat. Well, today, because of these time prices have fallen for wheat and rice and corn by 90% since 1960. It means that somebody in India that was spending 8 hours a day now spends less than an hour a day to earn the money to buy their food. So now they have another 6-7 hours a day to be able to devote to going to school or pursuing something. So that time inequality, that difference between someone in the U.S. and someone in India, their time inequality has collapsed dramatically. Now, we enjoy it too in the U.S. We spend less and less time working to earn the money to buy our food, and we could argue about whether it's healthy or not, but clearly we spend less and less time to buy our food. What that has done is it's given the poorest on the planet, the least advantaged, this opportunity now to have much more time that they can now devote to other activities. So in that sense, we think it's been a great benefit for those individuals. Now, when we think about crime today in cities and those kinds of challenges, they may not be economic challenges. There may be something else that's going on there, a political or a social issue that's not because these people are hungry.
Which is often the case. So this is another one of these three things that I was thinking of, is just like, when you're describing all this, you're imagining a somewhat functioning market economy, right? Where basically the market determines prices, whereas there's a lot of economies out there which are not market economies, which are planned economies. So does this work across all types of economies?
It does. One of the things that we say is that our abundance is a function of population and the freedom to innovate. So you can have a lot of people, but they don't have the freedom to innovate. Your abundance is going to be stuck. It's where China was in the 1960s and 1970s. But I would also say that your composition of families can also have an effect on this factor. And this is a part of the study that we're working on right now, is if you have an increasing fertility rate, you tend to grow your economy. And if that fertility rate goes down or decreases, your economic growth also decreases. So it's part of this, I would say that part of this crime thing might be not the economic growth, but the fact that we are not forming families like we have historically. So, if you've got fatherlessness, if you've got other things that are going on, it's like that's a poverty, a social poverty, not an economic poverty.